Hello, students. This is Professor McDermott. Well, the late 18th century is often called the Age of Revolutions because this was the period when Enlightenment political thinking and all the discussions that had taken place in coffee houses and Masonic lodges about natural law and other political concepts finally bore fruit in two major revolutions that threatened to sweep away the old medieval order of Europe entirely. The first took place, of course, in America. How did that come about, the American Revolution? Well, really, it had its origins in an earlier war called the Seven Years' War, or usually called in this country the French and Indian War, because it started here in North America as a war between British colonists and French colonists and the French colonist Indian allies. But as it went on, it became a major world war. The two main protagonists were Great Britain against France, and the ultimate result was a British victory over France. After which, France had to give up all of its colonies in North America, Canada, and Louisiana. And how did that lead to the American Revolution? Well, fairly enough, after the Seven Years' War was over, the British government decided that since they had largely fought the war to defend the American colonists from the French colonists, that the American colonists should actually pay part of the bill because Britain had racked up huge debts from the war. And so the King, George III, and Parliament began to raise taxes on the American colonists. And the American colonists, who had largely taxed themselves since their settling, really didn't like being taxed by the mother country, England. And so they staged what was probably the world's most successful tax revolt in history, starting in 1775, the American Revolution, and ultimately won their independence from Great Britain. But if you want the full story on that, you're going to have to take my U.S. History 1 course. In this course, we're going to focus on events in France, which were very much linked to the American Revolution. Because the French were our major ally in the War of the Revolution. In 1778, our ambassador in France, Benjamin Franklin, convinced the French King Louis XVI to sign a treaty of alliance with us. And France supplied us with a great deal of money, weapons, soldiers, ships, which really made it possible for us to win the war. The United States, I'm convinced, would not have won the war without France's support. Now, this, of course, was not totally unselfish on the part of the French. Having recently been defeated by the British in the Seven Years' War, they naturally wanted revenge. And supporting us was a great way for the French to get back at the British government. I will mention, this is getting ahead of the story a little bit, but even though the French gave us that remarkable assistance during our own War of Independence, when the French Revolution happened, that we'll talk about shortly, our first president, George Washington, refused to honor the Treaty of Alliance with France and refused to help defend France against its enemies because he didn't like the way that the French Revolution was going. And this set an example for the rest of American history, or at least for the first 100 years of American history, of the U.S. staying isolated and out of foreign wars, foreign conflicts. We call this trend isolationism, and we'll talk more about it later in the course. Many historians have discussed the difference between the American and the French revolutions. The American Revolution is usually portrayed as being a much more conservative revolution in which property owners got to keep their property. Most social institutions stayed in place after the revolution, just in a reorganized fashion. But the French Revolution really swept away most of what had gone before it, and people have asked the question, what was the source of the difference? Well, this is my opinion about the difference. I think it had to do with the differing paths that the Enlightenment took. First of all, in England and America, as opposed to the path that it took in France. In England and America, Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, for example, um, were not often traditional Christians. A lot of the founding fathers were not traditionally Orthodox believers. However, for the most part, English and American thinkers did keep the idea that the natural law of God came from a God who was a person. In other words, a God who was a divine lawgiver. And that this divine lawgiver also was the source of the natural rights, life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, that human beings enjoyed. And so you could say that for the English and American Enlightenment thinkers, the natural law still had some moral force, some ethical content. In other words, when you think that there's a personal God enforcing this natural law and protecting people's natural rights, you're more likely to obey that law and to respect those rights. However, French thinkers increasingly moved away from the idea that God was a personal being. Many French Enlightenment thinkers were what we call deists. The deist view of God was that there was a God, but that he was kind of like a clockmaker who had made the universe and then wound it up and just let it run, and never interfered with the universe after the original creation. So they saw God as kind of distant and uninvolved. Other French Enlightened thinkers were what we call pantheists. They didn't think God was a person, they just thought God was in everything. So God might be in your desk or your pencil or a tree. Everything was God. And still others were downright atheists and didn't believe in God at all. So when French Enlightenment thinkers talked about the natural law, they tended to see it more or less as just another scientific law, like the law of gravity, something that you would know based solely on your reason, but that really didn't have any religious or moral or ethical background, and certainly was not being enforced by a personal God. And so I think we'll see as the French Revolution unfolded, even though the French revolutionaries initially proclaimed that they believed people had certain natural rights, as it went on, increasingly those rights were taken away because of the lack of belief in a God who would protect them and who would punish people who took away other people's rights. Now, the American Revolution really led to the French Revolution in a very direct way, because France spent an enormous amount of money helping us to gain our independence, and they accumulated huge war debts and had to figure out ways to raise taxes to pay off those war debts. The King of France at the time of the American Revolution was Louis XVI. Notice XVI, Louis XVI. Louis XVI really wanted to rule as an enlightened absolutist monarch, like Frederick the Great of Prussia. He wanted to make progressive reforms, and he wanted to be an absolute king. But the problem was Louis the 16th was really in the wrong job. He wasn't as bright as Frederick. He didn't have a very commanding presence. His main interest in life was locksmithing. That was his hobby. And this led to many jokes after his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, failed to get pregnant for the first several years of their marriage. People in France would often comment that Louis's key couldn't find the lock. So Louis XVI was not really the man to govern France during this difficult time. Adding to the problem, if you recall, Louis XIV had made the nobility of France exempt from most taxes in return for their support. And so increasingly, the poor peasants of France were overtaxed, overwhelmed by taxes to pay off this huge debt from the American Revolution. And to make matters worse, the harvest in the year 1787 was terrible. Many crops failed, peasants were starving because the price of bread, which was mainly what French peasants ate, went up astronomically between 1787 and 1788. And so there was a great deal of unrest in France, rumors of rebellion and armed revolt simmering. And so Louis XVI decided to do something really out of the ordinary in 1789. He called a meeting of the Estates General. Now, you may recall that this is the French version of the English Parliament, but that it had not been allowed to meet by any king of France since the year 1614. And so this was really an extraordinary event. Now, a little bit about how the Estates General was organized. It was called the Estates General because it was believed there were 3 estates of the realm, and each estate met separately. The first estate consisted of clergy, that is, Catholic priests and other Catholics who were in holy orders and working for the church. The second estate was the nobility, the dukes, the counts, the lords. And the third estate consisted of everybody else in France. In other words, the vast majority of the people in France belonged to the third estate. But altogether, the third estate only had about as many representatives as the clergy and nobility did put together. And so, in this time of revolutionary ideas, people began to question the role of the Third Estate, what role it should take in French politics. And in 1789, a very influential pamphlet was published by a member of the Catholic clergy, Abbé Sieyès, entitled, "What is the Third Estate?" And it starts out with these words. First, what is the Third Estate? Everything. Second, what has it been heretofore in the political order? Nothing. Third, what does it demand? To become something. So Abbé Sieyès was saying that even though it was the Third Estate that really was the heart of the kingdom, that did nearly all the work and paid nearly all the taxes, up to that point they had been nothing in the French political system. And they didn't demand everything, but they wanted to become something. And so when the Estates General finally met, the Third Estate demanded that instead of voting by estates, typically a vote in the Estates General was taken by estates, which meant that the clergy got 1 vote, the nobility got 1 vote, and the Third Estate got 1 vote. And so often the clergy and nobility could outvote the Third Estate on any issue. And so the Third Estate demanded that instead of counting estates, that heads be counted. And that would give them a chance, at least, to take the leading role in these proceedings. On June 17th, 1789, Abbé Sieyès made a motion in the meeting of the Third Estate in which, the motion said that the Third Estate was the National Assembly. In other words, that it was the legislature of France without the nobility and clergy involved, and that they were in fact the rulers of France. And the Third Estate passed this motion. A couple days later, the Third Estate tried to have a meeting, actually 3 days later on June the 20th, and they got to their meeting hall and they found it was locked. And so they suspected that King Louis had locked them out to prevent them from asserting their power as the rulers of France, as they saw it. And so they went to the nearest place they could find that was open, which happened to be an indoor tennis court. And there on the tennis court, they swore an oath to support and stand by each other, so that the Third Estate really could become the dominant power in France. Now, King Louis did take note of all these developments. Of course, they made him very nervous, but he decided to make some concessions to the Third Estate. First, he abolished lettres de cachet. What were those? Basically, it was a document the king could sign to throw anyone in jail and throw away the key for as long as he wanted. So he abolished that practice. He also abolished the land tax, which had fallen very heavily on the poor peasant landowners. And finally, he ordered the nobility and the clergy to join the Third Estate in their meetings, which did tend to lend some legitimacy to the Third Estate's claim to have supreme power. And these concessions, far from dampening the revolutionary fervor, only increased the electric mood of excitement in Paris. By the way, one of the videos that I have posted in Module 7 in the folder for your extra credit assignment is about the French Revolution, and you might want to watch that to supplement this lecture, because the French Revolution was a hugely exciting and world-shaking event, and it is hard to do it justice in the lecture format. So that video really does bring it to life, and I think you would really enjoy it, even though it's not mandatory. So, with the French crowd electrified and excited, on July 14th, they decided to attack one of the most hated symbols of the absolutist monarchy, the Bastille prison, which is where many of those poor prisoners who had been jailed through lettres de cachet were thrown and left to rot. And so basically the mob attacked the prison. They were able to get into the prison. They killed the director of the prison, and then they paraded his head around Paris on a large pointy stick, which should tell you something about the French Revolution. You know, sometimes people call this whole period the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment is sometimes called the Age of Reason, because reason, intelligence, was supposed to be supreme. But when the French Revolution erupts, you see that it really, in a way, was not about reason. It was very much about emotion. That is, the pent-up anger of the French common people against the system that had controlled them for so many years. But in any case, the Bastille was taken by the French Parisian crowd, and over time it was completely dismantled, torn down entirely. And this is why the French celebrate their Independence Day on July 14th, which is called Bastille Day. On August 4th, the new National Assembly, led by the Third Estate, decided to abolish feudalism. In other words, they stripped the nobility of all their great noble titles, Duke, Count, Marquis, and so on, and said that from henceforth every French person would be equal. And they followed that up in September 1789 with the very famous document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Group 1, you're going to be reading this document, and your discussion questions will be about it. And so this is really, in a sense, the French Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights wrapped up into one, in which the natural rights of every person are supposed to be protected, but there are loopholes, and those loopholes we will discuss Group 1, and then everyone else will get a chance to hear about them in my video introduction to the next module. What about women's role in the revolution? It's interesting. There was a woman in Paris, a writer named Olympe de Gouges, and when she read the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, she was outraged that it didn't make any mention of women's rights. or women's issues. And so she drafted her own document called the Declaration of the Rights of Woman, in which she complained about the National Assembly's total omission of women's rights, and talked about the system of oppression that women were enduring in France, and called for revolution among women to throw off the chains of sexism. But um, very few of the male leaders of the French Revolution were interested in women's concerns. As we've seen, most enlightened thinkers tended to accept traditional gender roles, and ultimately, Olympe de Gouges became one of the victims of that great French invention known as the guillotine, a giant razor to chop off people's heads in the public square. Um, and in a way, that's very ironic because women actually did play a major role in the French Revolution, especially in the actions of the crowd in Paris. Why was that? Why did women often take the lead in these mob actions? Well, if you think about it, um, who is a policeman more likely to shoot or beat up or throw in jail, a man or a woman? You see, the gender codes of the time protected women in a certain way. Men obviously were not supposed to hit women, certainly not kill them. And so often, women who took part in these actions were more or less immune from punishment, unlike their husbands or brothers. So it was often the case that women did play a major role. Also, when you think about the cause of the French Revolution, one of the causes, the hunger and the deprivation that people felt, it was very natural that women would play a role in this, because they were the ones who did the shopping and the cooking for their families. So they were, in a sense, the ones who were most nearly affected. Well, one of the most famous episodes of the Revolution, on October the 5th, 1789, a large crowd of mostly women marched from Paris all the way to the royal palace at Versailles, and they attacked the royal family there at the palace. And especially these women from Paris hated the queen, Marie Antoinette. It's very interesting to see these radical women venting their anger on another woman. Why? Well, Marie Antoinette was seen as the symbol of how out of touch the French royal family was with the reality of life in France. She was from a foreign country, Austria. That was one strike against her. And she paid a lot of attention, obviously, to her clothing and her fantastic hairstyles and so forth, and to luxuries like that. And also, when the famines had first started, there was a famous quote that she had supposedly said when she heard that the people of France had no bread. It was reported that she said, "Well, let them eat cake." We don't know if she really said that or not, but the important thing was that the French people believed she had said it, and that made her hugely unpopular. So, in this attack on October 5th, the king and queen just barely escaped with their lives, and what ultimately wound up happening was that they were taken back to Paris and essentially put under house arrest for the rest of their lives. And under duress, Louis XVI finally did accept the abolition of the nobility on August 4th. So he basically became a prisoner of the revolutionaries in Paris. He did, however, continue to play some role in the French government as a sort of figurehead under the new constitution that the National Assembly passed in 1791. The king did have a few little jobs to do. One thing he could do, he couldn't actually veto laws, but he could delay them for a year from taking effect if he didn't like them. He was also given the job of managing foreign policy and commanding the army. So this is what we call a constitutional monarchy, where you kind of like England today, where you basically do have a king or queen, but his or her role is mostly symbolic. This 1791 Constitution was somewhat conservative in other ways, too. Not every adult male was allowed to vote. under this constitution. The only men who could vote were men who paid at least 3 days' wages every year in tax money to the government, and obviously women were not allowed to vote at all, so the political franchise was somewhat limited. And that drew a lot of criticism from the more radical revolutionaries, people like the journalist Jean Paul Marat and the fiery rabble-rousing speechmaker Georges Jacques Danton. Both attacked the 1791 Constitution, saying that it did not go far enough in a revolutionary direction. And this more radical viewpoint began to gain support in France when, very unwisely, Louis XVI loaded up his family in a coach and tried to escape from Paris in June 1791, trying to get to his wife's homeland of Austria so that they could be safe from the revolution. But in a little town called Varennes on the French border, they were recognized, captured, and taken back to Paris. And that was really the end of the popularity of the royal family. Pretty much everybody treated them as traitors after that point, and their days were certainly numbered. In an attempt to fire up patriotic fervor in revolutionary France, then the French decided to declare war against the Holy Roman Empire, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in April of 1792, supposedly to defend the revolution from the royalist threat. By the way, in the National Assembly, there were two sides to the room where they met, the left side and the right side, and the more radical elements, the ones who really wanted a republic with no king, sat on the left side, and the ones who wanted to keep the king as the head of state sat on the right side, the monarchists. And so if you ever hear a political commentator on CNN, for example, use the term left-wing or right-wing, these terms come from the French Revolution. A left-winger is someone who's more liberal or radical, whereas a right-winger is someone who's more conservative or traditional. The leadership of the left wing belonged to a group of men who united in an organization called the Jacobin Club, which included Danton, Marat, and another very fiery revolutionary leader named Maximilien Robespierre. And so, under the leadership of the members of the Jacobin Club, the National Assembly finally decided to abolish the monarchy and to proclaim a French Republic on September the 21st of 1792. They then renamed themselves the National Convention and allowed all adult males, no matter how much money they had or how much taxes they paid, to vote in elections for the National Convention. So the Republic began moving in a much more radical direction, and as a symbol of that, Louis XVI was beheaded. On the left, you see there the guillotine, which was originally invented by a medical doctor, Dr. Guillotin, because he believed it was the most humane method of execution, to have this huge sharp blade simply snap your head off in an instant. And frankly, I think he had a point. It does seem much more humane to me as executions go than, say, lethal injection or the electric chair. But the guillotine was put to terrifying use in revolutionary France. Not only was the king beheaded in January 1793, also his wife, Marie Antoinette, was executed in October of 1793, and the guillotine would claim tens of thousands of victims throughout France during the Revolution. Well, by this time, especially after the execution of the royal family, the other nations of Europe were becoming very, very alarmed, especially since they were also ruled by kings and queens, and they didn't like the precedent that was being set of royals getting their heads chopped off. And so all the great powers of Europe, Great Britain, the Netherlands, Prussia, Austria, and Spain, decided to unite in an attempt to destroy the French Revolution, to restore the monarchy to France and to make war on the French Republic. We call this the First Coalition united against France. And it might seem, with all those heavy hitters lined up against it, that the French Republic didn't have much chance of survival. But it really shocked the world by doing exceptionally well in this war of the First Coalition. How did it achieve that? Well, Group 3, your first document is called the Levée-en-Masse Edict, and it talks about how basically every person in France, not just men, but old people, women, and children as well, were expected to play some role in the war effort. Men of fighting age were drafted into the army. Other people had other tasks to do to support the war effort. And what we see here really is the awesome power of the ordinary people in a modern state finally being tapped. Previously in European history, wars were carried on by professional soldiers, by knights, a few mounted knights on horseback, etc. And it was a gentleman's game. But the French showed that by tapping into the power of the masses, the ordinary people in society, by getting them invested through allowing them to vote, for instance, you would really unleash almost unlimited power, unlimited destructive power, military power. And this was a lesson that was not forgotten. And as we talk later about the great 20th century wars, World War I, World War II, you should think back to the French Revolution, the first government that really showed what you can do when you have a total war, when your total society is organized. And they did so well in this war that they were actually able to expand into the Netherlands and also into Italy, and to suppress revolts that took place in different regions of France, the most famous of which was in the Vendée, which you see there on the map to the west along the Atlantic coast. The region of the Vendée revolted mainly because it was very Catholic, very faithful to the Catholic Church, and they didn't like the attack of the revolution on the church that we'll talk about shortly. But the Vendée revolt was brutally suppressed by the French army of draftees in 1793, and many citizens were summarily executed in very brutal ways. Now we come to the event known as the Terror, because even though France was doing very well in this war, the revolution had become somewhat paranoid, and the leaders of the revolution began to see traitors lurking behind every bush. They thought that there were monarchist elements among the people that were conspiring to overthrow the revolution, enemies to the state everywhere they looked. And so the French revolutionary leaders began to round up people that were suspected of being hostile to the revolution and throwing them in jail and throwing away the key. So in a sense, really not much had changed from the days of the old regime. And Group 3, your second document, is about how people that were suspected of being traitors were treated in revolutionary France. So in spite of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the supposedly protected people's rights, somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 French people were slaughtered on the guillotine simply because they were suspected, with or without any real evidence, of being enemies to the state. Now, what about the revolution and the church? As we saw, there were many church leaders like Abbé Sieyès who had supported the cause of the poor people at the beginning of the revolution. However, the revolutionary leaders knew they wanted the hearts and minds of French people for the revolution. They didn't want to have to share any of their authority with the Catholic Church. They didn't want any rival for supremacy. And they also needed the church's great wealth in order to run the revolution and later to win the war. So already in 1789, the National Assembly confiscated Um, the land and the goods belonging to the Catholic Church, which included many great art treasures, beautiful buildings, priceless jewels, and so forth, that were in the church treasuries, and they used them to support the revolutionary regime. Then in 1790, the civil constitution of the French clergy was passed, and this had a devastating effect on the Catholic Church in France. All religious communities of men and women, that is, monks, sisters, monasteries, convents, these were all abolished, they were confiscated, and their members had to become private citizens. The parish priests were allowed to remain serving as priests, but instead of working for the Catholic Church, from that point forward, they worked for the government and they got their paycheck from the government. And of course, that meant that they were controlled by the government because obviously, um, whoever signs your paycheck is going to have a lot of leverage over what you do. And furthermore, all of these priests had to swear that they supported the revolution over the Pope. And so, in a sense, what was left of the Catholic Church in France was co opted for the revolutionary cause. Now, this bullet point I think will give you some idea of really how radical the French Revolution was. And I want to mention Group 2. Your author this time is a man named the Marquis de Condorcet, who, even though he was a high French nobleman, supported the revolution and ultimately lost his life because he was suspected of being a traitor to the revolution. But while he was still alive, he was totally gung-ho for the revolution, and the document you're going to read expresses his hopes for the world once the old institutions of church and state were swept away. Condorcet says he thought that human nature could become perfect, absolutely perfect, with those old corrupt institutions gone. And so, really, the French Revolution wanted to create more than a new government. It wanted to change people's consciousness. It wanted to change people's hearts completely and make a new kind of humanity. And I think the place where this shows forth most clearly is in the French Revolutionary calendar. One of the things that the French Revolutionary government did was to abolish the old calendar with the traditional names of the months and to create a new calendar. First of all, instead of counting time from the birth of Jesus, henceforth French people were supposed to count time from the year 1792, the beginning of the Republic, and that became the year 1. And so 1793 was year 2, etc., etc. And the months were all given new names, mostly taken from science. For example, there was a month called Brumaire, which meant foggy. And there was another month called Thermidor, which was in the summer, it meant hot. But the most radical part of it was that the week was lengthened from 7 to 10 days, and there were 3 weeks every month. And then at the end of the year, the extra days were put into this period of a festival period and celebration of the revolution. What was the point of extending the week? Well, uh, formerly, with the 7-day week, nobody worked on Sunday. Everybody got the day off. So if you extended the week to 10 days, then people would have to work 9 days before they got the day off. And that increased, again, the manpower that could be poured into supporting the revolution. And so, really, this was an incredibly radical effort to shape the entire way that people saw the world, the things they took most for granted, how we tell time, and the days and months and years. So, it gives you a sense of how radical this revolution really was. Also, the French revolutionary leaders tried to wean the people away from Christianity. And to do this, they created a new religion that was called the Cult of the Supreme Being. And the Supreme Being was like the deist God, far away and distant. And the real God, of course, was the revolution itself. That's what people were worshiping in the Cult of the Supreme being, but they invented new rituals and festivals and so forth as part of this new religious cult of the French Revolution. But they say he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, and that was true of many of the French revolutionary leaders. Marat was put on trial as a suspected traitor, but he was acquitted. This was very rare in revolutionary France during the Terror, but he was acquitted, found not guilty. However, shortly thereafter, Marat was at home one day in July 1793, and he was doing what he usually did while he worked, taking a bath. He had this very painful skin condition, and the only way he could find relief was to sit in a medicinal bath for most of the day. So he was in the bathtub when a royalist woman named Charlotte Corday burst into his bathroom and stabbed him to death there in the tub. And of course, she was captured and later guillotined for that. But that was the end of Marat. Danton's fate was to die on the guillotine in April of 1794 as a suspected traitor. And finally, even Robespierre, the greatest of the three leaders, was executed on July 28, 1794. That is the ninth day of the French Revolutionary month of Thermidor. And this really signaled a change in the revolution because a group of members of the National Assembly, more conservative members, decided that the revolution had just gone too far and they needed to get rid of radical leaders like Robespierre and reestablish some order. And so Thermidor was really kind of a coup in which 5 men took over the government of France, calling themselves the Directory. It was a sort of committee to try to reestablish some order out of the chaos that revolutionary France had become. And so, under the Directory, once again, fewer people were allowed to vote. The terror was curbed somewhat. But really, the job of establishing order and ending the revolution finally would fall to the very great man we call Napoleon Bonaparte. However, that will be the subject of a future lecture.